Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Julia La Roche Show. We are joined by a returning guest. We have Neil Howe, historian, demographer, and author of multiple books, including his newest, The Fourth Turning is Here. We recorded our conversation with Neil on Friday, July 12th. We will air that conversation in full. But given the events that transpired over the weekend with the attempted assassination of former President Trump at a rally in Pennsylvania, we felt it was important to have Neil back on to get his reaction to those events. So we recorded a shorter episode on Sunday, July 14th, that we are going to have air at the beginning of this conversation, just giving you all some context. We will air the full episode that we taped on Friday right behind it. Now, the fourth turning is the crisis period that we are currently in. We discuss what that means, how the political polarization is emblematic of that, and some hopeful words for the future and how we can get out of this crisis. I really enjoyed having Neil back on the show. I always learn from him, and I know you will too. Neil Howe, welcome back to the show. We are recording on Sunday, July 14th at approximately 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Neil, I've seen a lot of conversations around the fourth turning on Twitter, and some people are even asking, and I've had people even ask me because they know I talked to you, was what we saw happen on Saturday afternoon, this attempted assassination of former President Trump, is that a product of the fourth turning? What has been kind of your reaction to what we've seen transpire?
Well, Julia, clearly assassinations are possible at any time, right? We had several of them, as you recall, in the 1960s. And we had a lot of comparisons with Teddy Roosevelt when he was running his Bull Moose campaign. Actually got shot in the chest miraculously. The bullet was somewhat deflected. He kept on giving his speech, and that was certainly not a fourth turning. So I think the way to think about it is that events can be incendiary depending on the era in which they occur, and they're incendiary in different ways. I think what we've tried to sketch out in looking at seasonality of history, that they become much more incendiary in a fourth turning because so much seems to be riding on the balance, right? In other words, if you have this great polarization, this enormous partisanship, if people feel that their country is about to go in one direction or another, right? Then these events assume huge importance in a way that they really wouldn't in another time. People wonder if that bullet had been a little bit, a couple inches in another direction, what would it have done? I think you can imagine what would it have done. The anger, the passion, recriminations would have flown. It's interesting on this particular event. I do think that there will be a lot of investigation. There's a lot we still have to know about it, but there will be investigation about how well the Secret Service did their job. I mean, what was that? 450 feet, someone on a roof. That was very close. You'd think they would have been checking for that. And in fact, there were actually spectators who were pointing out to the Secret Service as there was a guy climbing there. But you know what I mean? That was like the closest possibility to position. So I do think that's going to become an issue. But I think that's just a competence issue. There's no question that these were professionals trying to do their job as best as can, as best as they could do it. We live in an era in which people are becoming more tolerant of violence. This has been tracked by a number of opinion surveys, which actually show a rising share of Americans think that violence is maybe okay or maybe necessary to resolve the current impasse that America seems to be in politically. Some of these recent surveys I've shows it's continuing to grow since the pandemic. It's now somewhere about 1/5 or 1/4 of Americans say that violence is okay, to defend liberty, to defend democracy, to make history move in the right direction. And keep this in mind, Julia, and that is that we've had many of these near attempts. I believe Brett Kavanaugh and Sonia Sotomayor both had nearly successful attempts. We had another one with Sam Alito, actually, after that abortion decision, actually went public and said, he was afraid of assassination after the pre-publication of the abortion decision. So we're in, what I mean? What I mean to say is we're already here. We're kind of in this mood. Congressmen and particularly senators are spending a large amount of money on personal protection over and above what the Secret Security offers. So this is already part of their lives. So if you do run and succeed in having a position in public office, you're already aware of that. You understand that's part of an extra cost of your life. I guess what I'm trying to say is let's just put that in the perspective of the era in which we're living.
Yeah, certainly. And for folks who are just watching and listening for the first time, we will get into the fourth turning and the four turnings in this episode. And the fourth turning is the crisis period, that period of upheaval. I think what scares me, Neil, and I thought about this morning, if it were a different outcome, what that would be like, what the country would be like, what we would be waking up to this morning. And it even scares me to even think about that. But I got to put that question to you as well. And I don't know if you would even know, but it is a really terrifying thought.
Well, think about those other eventualities I talked about. I mean, think of all these other attempted assassinations if they had succeeded and what the reaction would have been, right? I guess you could say the likelihood, perhaps we should be philosophical about it, is that sooner or later an attempt like that will succeed, right? Because there are many of them now. And how would we react to that? It would heighten the odds on both sides, certainly, right? It would lead us to a greater sense of an either or in politics. It would kind of push the fourth turning mood, one notch up. And I think it fourth turnings, I think, are eras that remind us of the contingency in history. There are eras in history where if a big accident happens, everything just still can find its way back to normal. And in fact, when you think about those assassinations in the 1960s, John Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., in a way, society did get back on track, right? I think things are different in a fourth turning when so many people are looking for a sudden rupture in political life and in public life, and for the nation to take a suddenly new direction. And I think that actually wasn't really in the cards back in the 60s and 70s, when despite the fact there was a huge amount of protest by younger generations, still civic institutional life in America was pretty strong. People still did trust government. That no longer is true, and particularly for younger people. And I think a lot is going to be looked at a lot of lonely and disconnected young people who feel they aren't, connected to anything. They have no trust in the system right today. And that is also going to be cause for much discussion, right? What do young people look at today when they look at America? Do they look at a system that works, or do they see a system that's completely dysfunctional?
Yeah. You mentioned the breakdown of trust. I want to hear more on that, especially around institutions. Where are you seeing more of that trust break down even further? And then maybe a second question is, where are people even finding trust these days?
Well, unfortunately, I guess you could say unfortunately, where they're finding trust is within their own tribe, right? and which means that you have a community of people who kind of are aligned with you and how you talk about things, what you believe in, and people are finding that, right? They are finding it too in their families. This is something I guess we will talk about, and that is sort of the very interesting renaissance or revival in extended family life in America that I found very interesting, which is partly what people are reverting to. But in terms of something that's larger than the family, which is almost what you identify with civic life, it has to be larger than just your own family. You know what I mean? That's where there's a big vacuum. Instead, they're big tribes, and we have two big ones today in America. One wants to go in a very different direction than the other, and in fact, they don't even have the same language. They really don't speak to each other. They don't bother. There's no point, right? No one's listening on the other side anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a very good point. The divisiveness is, I guess, we talked about in this episode your worries around November 5th. How do you see a path forward with things being so divisive?
Well, they're typically two paths forward when you have internal divisions like this, and that is, one side wins, and the other side is pretty much compelled to sort of go along, or both sides are kind of scared straight by something external, right? Those are the two options, and again, in the book, I go kind of through all the different scenarios and how that's played out. There is no easy way out once you get into this problem. And I think it's interesting when you think about where we've come today. I think everyone who's lived over the past several decades very easily understands how we go from a society that is cohesive, where people trust institutions, there's a strong sense of community, to the sense of entropy. Everything kind of breaks down. We're all sort of believing ourselves as individuals, but we no longer have any idea how we function as a community anymore. We're very familiar with that process, but we're very unfamiliar with the opposite process, right? With how do we actually exercise reverse entropy? How do individuals become communities? And historically, as you look back, it goes one way just as often as it goes the other. There's an interesting interview with Robert Putnam, the sociologist, probably the best known sociologist in America, who wrote the book Bowling Alone, about how America is becoming increasingly individualistic, right? I mean, we went bowling with the Elks Club or the Kiwanis Club, or, we went with big groups. Now we just go bowling alone. I mean, that was the title of his book. But he charts how through all kinds of different indicators, Americans just are more alone than they used to be. We used to be in these cohesive communities at every level of our lives, right? From politics to social events to inviting neighbors over for dinner and leaving our doors unlocked and, just everything you can imagine. Some of them very, very creative, right? And he says, all of those things have gone in the same direction, and it's been largely generational. I agree with that. I think it has been generational. He said boomers were the one who discovered individualism and started taking things in that direction. And Xers are sort of, taking it further, having grown up in this era of individualism. And he said historically, it always goes back the other way. And in fact, he called his most recent book The Upswing, because he expects it now to go the other way. I actually support Putnam, in his long-term prognosis. I think he's correct. I think it has gone constantly both ways in American history. But I'm not one thing he doesn't investigate terribly closely is how it usually goes the other way. I mean, he acknowledges that what made it go the other way initially was the Great Depression and World War II. But what he doesn't really investigate is what are the ingredients of that era which caused community to reform. And indeed, what was similar about that era and earlier eras, we call fourth turnings, in which community was reformed. These eras do have something in common. And, like Robert Putnam, I like to think a lot about how that process takes place.
So, reforming communities, I imagine, Neil, that has to do with the millennials, or like the hero archetype. I would love for you to explain that as well. But imagine my generation will play a really important role in leading us out of the fourth turning and into the first turning.
Yeah, your generation, the one coming after it as well. And a little bit like the GI generation and the silent generation did, going into the late 40s and 50s. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy. I mean, that whole what William O'Neill, the historian, called the American high. And that was about a 20-year period, about a generation-long period. So, we talk about that. That's part of the book. I think we'll get into that.
Certainly. I know it's a Sunday. You're taking time out of your weekend to hop on here, and we appreciate it. Before I let you go, can you leave us with some parting thoughts, maybe something to think about going forward, maybe something that's a bit more reflective as well, just given the events of the weekend before we let you go?
Well, look, I guess we should all, reflect on all the things that could go bad and don't. In many ways, we're blessed to live in a world where what actually happens is not the sum of all of our fears of what could happen, right? And be thankful, that not everything that we're afraid of happening could happen. I think sometimes in a time like this, it's important to be hopeful about the future. And one thing I did try to do in my most recent book is be hopeful about our long-term destination. It's easy to be despairing, as though history is just going in a one-way direction forever, the dissolution of everything. But that's not how history works. We are a very rugged species, Homo sapiens. And within our culture, we have endured so much. And I think one thing to think about, maybe reflect on, is that it's not so much hardship, which we have a hard time dealing with. I think we are hardwired for hardship. I mean, that's no problem. You know what I mean? Hardship, enduring, when we have a sense of purpose. I think what we don't do well coping with is feeling disconnected, alone, and without purpose. It's hardship we can handle, but not knowing where we're going and whether we have a future or whether we can even envision a future that works, that's difficult. But once we do have a direction, once we do have hope, which is in a way, I know this sounds surprising, but it actually is what my book tries to provide. There is something better down the road, that it's much easier to endure the hardship until we get there.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Neil Howe, author of The Fourth Turning, is here. Thank you so much again for being so generous with your time. I really appreciate you coming back on. Be well, and until we see you next time. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you, Julie.
Neil Howe, demographer, historian, author of multiple books, including your newest, The Fourth Turning, is here. What the seasons of history tell us about how and when this crisis will end. It is so great to welcome you back on the show, Neil. Great to have you again. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Julia. It's great to be here. And by the way, I was pleased to say that, see that book copy you just held up. It's the paperback. I myself have not seen it yet.
Actually, you know what? I got to tell you something. This was like the advanced copy.
Okay. It was original. All right.
Not the paperback. And I also have the audiobook version too. And I think the last time I had you, I told you I had read the fourth turning, your book from 1997 that was so popular, because I feel like every time I would talk to different investors, they would reference we're in the fourth turning. And I was like, okay, what is that? And understanding that, I think I read it back in 2011, 2012, thereabouts. And I'm just excited to have you on because, gosh, I feel like everywhere I look, there are just more and more signposts about the fourth turning that we're currently in. And a lot of folks who are watching, listening, Neil, they've read your work, they follow your work. I'm sure many are familiar, but for maybe those who are not, let's just step back and help everyone understand your framework in which you look at the world. This the four turnings, the generational theory. We can set the table, take all the time you need, share some of the vocabulary, if you will. So let's just step back and talk about the framework first.
Yeah, well, I got into this actually a long time ago, really in the late 1980s. And as you know, Julia, my co-author and I, Bill Strauss, who actually passed away about 10 years ago, we weren't interested really so much in history. We're interested in generational change, particularly how so many boomers our age had been so different from the generation that raised us, which was the World War II winning, GI generation, that was really Promethean in the sense of all it did and built and, conquering half the world, and then a Cold War against communism, finally defeating that, trips to the moon, interstate highways. I mean, the Jetsons, what else do you want after pulling America out of the Great Depression as young adults? Boomers are very different and with a very different set of priorities, much more oriented around vision and values, Woodstock rather than D-Day. And we were all very aware of it. And we were interested in, and this was back in the 1980s when still boomers didn't have a president yet. The GIs were still president. In fact, we still elected them president all the way up until Bill Clinton came in really 1993. But we were interested in whether this had ever happened before, this kind of difference. And we went back and looked over many centuries of American history, looking for generational patterns. Why do some generations grow up so differently than others? And we went back really starting initially with the Puritan Great Migration to New England in the 1630s. Which is really the first really permanent, substantial migration from the old world to the new world and what today is the United States. And what we concluded was that these generational differences have always been there. They were perfectly apparent by reading letters and diaries and speeches of the time. And that not only were generations very different, even going all the way back to the 17th century, but they were different in a certain pattern. Certain times of generations always follow other types of generations. Today, we're familiar with how boomers, with all their, idealism about the world, were followed by Gen Xers who were famously into, survivalism, reality shows, the bottom line, the material world. And particularly when they were coming of age, really beginning in the 1980s and 90s. And that pattern has always been around, right? Following the Puritans came a generation in New England that was widely called the Cavalier generation. They're just in it for money. And they wondered, Mom, Dad, why did you bring us out to this howling wilderness? I mean, everything that's nice is back in England, and I know you're all saints and you have a close relationship with God, but really not into that. You know what I mean? And following what we often call the transcendental generation, would have been the peers of Walt Whitman and Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and just all of those commune founders and prophets. Around the time of the Second Great Awakening came the Gilded Generation, which is a generation of metal and muscle. These would have been the peers of Ulysses Grant and George Armstrong Custer. They didn't say very much, but they did a lot, and they certainly suffered. This was the generation that got largely bore the brunt of the Civil War. but it's interesting looking at these patterns. We see these things repeating themselves again and again. And if it is true that generations are shaped young by history and go on as senior leaders and parents to shape history, then generations provide a sort of a link between history itself. In other words, one thing a generation shaped by history is going on later on to shape history, which shapes the next generation coming along, right? So you see it's a closed circle. And in fact, one thing that we discovered in looking at generations is these patterns actually explain some of the long-term rhythms that people have seen in American history itself. For example, the fact that we have these very large and really, you might say, catastrophic crises in our civic life, in our public life, in the world of politics, the Constitution, law, infrastructure, our outer world of community, the things we build for each other, about once every long human lifetime. And we had that in the last quarter of the 17th century with the Glorious Revolution. It occurred here in the colonies as well as in England. Nathaniel's Rebellion, which is the first great revolution in the American colonies. King Philip's War, which was a devastating, a genocidal war in New England between the settlers and the Indians. A catastrophic quarter century in the late 17th century, followed as nearly a century later, a long human lifetime later, by the American Revolution, followed by the Civil War, followed by the New Deal and World War II, followed by here we are today, Julia, in what we call the next fourth turning. And in subsequent work, we actually stretched that back earlier in sort of the Anglo-American tradition. We've also looked at it increasingly as a global phenomenon. A lot of the things we see today, the rise of populist, authoritarian, ethnocentric leaders. This isn't just in America. This is all around the world. This is in Europe. This is in India, China, the Philippines, Burma. I mean, you look around, right? This is more than just here. This is increasingly these generational patterns, and these patterns of history are global. So here we are, and I will mention another pattern that we're all familiar with. Certainly, it's very important to boomers. And that is roughly halfway in between these great outer world upheavals of politics and institution building are the great awakenings of American history. I was talking about Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? But they came of age during the Great Awakenings, and very conveniently, Julie, in American history, we number those awakenings. We call them the first, second, third, fourth Great Awakening. And those tend to come, and also in a rhythm, roughly halfway between the outer world crisis. So you see the rhythm, right? Mm-hmm. We in the fourth turning, we remake the outer world. And then in what we call the second turning, the awakening, we remake the inner world of values, culture, religion in particular, and very often the arts, and everything having to do with sort of the interiority of our existence. You might say we perfect ourselves as individuals, whereas in the fourth turning, we perfect ourselves as communities. And that great basic yin and yang between exterior and community versus interior and individual is a very important theme that runs through, I think. You remember the fourth turning, but I do think that's a theme that runs through our model. And in the end, we wrote a book, Generations, in 1991, really describing the generational pattern. We followed it up with a book in 1997. That's when you referred to, which turned it around and really started with the pattern of history. And that was this idea that you had four turnings or seasons in a cycle. First turning, second, third, fourth, kind of like, spring, summer, winter, fall, winter. And I've written other books, about millennials, about Gen X. But very recently, last year, the book you just showed, your advanced copy. Wow. Yeah. It's funny because the paperback is supposed to come out right about now. That's why I just thought you had the first copy of the paperback, because it's been out in hardcover now for just over a year.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that was a book that came out last year, and that's the one that really updated the 1997 book and really brought it up into today. Where are we? Post Obama, post Trump, post Biden, post pandemic, post Russia invasion of the Ukraine. You know what I mean? This sort of where are we now? And I think in this book, very more than the book in 1997, and I will say this for people wanting to know, well, how are the books different? I would say in this new book, and I'd be interested in your opinion, Julia, how you've actually sampled both of them, but I would say in this new book, I spent a lot more time detailing how crises work. What is the internal? What are the patterns of a crisis? How do they start? How do they climax? How do they resolve? And if it is true that organized conflict is always part of the fourth turning, particularly its climax, is it internal and external? And I think I spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about that, about what a delicate knife edge that is between how it could tip either way. Mm-hmm. And also, I think I do more here on what's the global ramifications? How much do other countries, how is the participation of other areas of the world in this generational cycle? How has that grown? And for those who are sort of high concept, I also talk a little bit about the whole notion of complexity in social systems. And, what are these strange attractors? How can you have a approximate periodicity in a complex social system? And how do those kinds of things arise? I think I bring up the analogy of traffic patterns in New York City, where you have a complex system that has an approximate periodicity, which really can't be solved. I mean, it is a complex system, but history can be a little bit like that. There can be long-term social patterns, and I think I tie it to other patterns we see, for instance, in politics, culture, family life, demography, the economy. I should mention that here. After all, we talk about finance on this show.
Absolutely.
And, we talk about the K-wave. We talk about the long cycle. We talk about Carlota Perez and her long-term innovation cycle. So we can talk about those kinds of cycles too, but there is a long-term cyclicality in social life. And I think we're seeing one aspect of it playing out here.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of perfect timing to have you on, as you mentioned, the paperback coming out. And for folks watching, listening, if you haven't read the book, run to get a copy. It is so well written. I feel like, what I loved about it too is just the depth that you go in when it comes to like history. And I think this was probably the first time that I really gained like a deeper understanding of the other generations too, and how they were brought up. And I also learned in the book, this is like a silly aside, I learned that my husband is not a millennial actually. And I know you coined the term millennial, and I always thought he was a millennial, but according to your book, he is not. So he's a Gen Xer, which is kind of random. But I want to ask you, where we are right now, though, in the fourth turning and maybe more recent events, because it does make me curious. Like, let's talk about the election coming up, the recent debate between former President Trump and President Biden, and now a lot of calls for Biden to step down as the candidate. We are recording on Friday, July 12th. I don't know what's going to happen between now and by the time this airs on Tuesday. But does that also fit in, or I'm curious for your perspective, how that might fit into the fourth turning and this framework as well?
I think you're going to see a lot of risk-taking in public life. I mean, it's very interesting. As long as it was nearly 50-50, no one dared change anything, right? It was like, two animals sitting there head to head, and no one could possibly change and now that one side looks to be weaker, the other side's desperate, right? And one thing to keep in mind, and this is very common in fourth turnings, and that is to the extent to which this tribalization of America, where we see, blue zone and red zone really becoming tribal, living in completely different worlds. I mean, I actually live up here in West Virginia, and I can tell you, I lived for 30 years in right outside of DC, and I've gone from blue zone to red zone, and I might as well have moved to Moravia. You know what I mean? I mean, I'm in a completely different place, right? And this is disturbing because increasingly America is self-sorting. And I go through some of the statistics in the book to the extent that's true. This should remind a lot of people of what happened in the 1850s. As we completely separated as a country. Not only did the North and South, the churches began to separate: Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist. They all began to have a northern and southern wings, and then pretty soon we had parties that just represented, two regions, and ultimately that was the only new party we've ever had in American history. It was the Republican Party that completely represented only the North, right? Of course, their first successful election to the presidency was immediately followed by total war, right? So that was Abraham Lincoln, and so we have that aspect of it now, where we haven't really seen anything quite like that. I worry about November the 5th, because whoever wins that election, the other side is going to see that as an occupation, an illegitimate occupation. And from that moment, you will see the start of the resistance. You know what I mean? It's kind of like the Germans just moved into Paris, right? The resistance. Well, if that doesn't disturb you, I don't know what does. I mean, how do we get comity? But are we a single nation anymore? I worry about that. I think a lot of people worry about that. And this will lead to risk taking. In other words, as soon as the Democrats feel it's really slipping away. Now, if you ask me, I don't know. Obviously, I don't know what's going to happen. I suspect Joe Biden right now is trying to run out the clock, right? He wants to just leave it down to the time there's not enough time to switch. After all, if he doesn't formally abdicate, so to speak, all of the delegates to the convention really are kind of sworn to support him. Most of them have indicated they will continue to do so. I think there is a backdoor where it might be, Biden may feel that in the worst of circumstances, he'll just step down and let Kamala Harris, take over, which will solve the, capacity problem, at least in terms of, age and youth. And of course, what will that do to the red zone, right? If he wins. Now, if he can't win, what will the red zone do? How will the blue zone react? But we're kind of asking these questions where both of them are very uncomfortable at this point. Mm-hmm. However, I will say, Julia, that I'm equally disturbed by what's going on geopolitically. Not only do we have this ongoing war in the Ukraine, where it looks like the Russians have really tipped the balance. We now have clear evidence coming in of China supplying the Russians, not directly, but indirectly with all the components they need. And Europe clearly with their focus elsewhere, and a whole new front threatening to break out, really orchestrated by Iran. The next big front that I'm looking at is Hezbollah and Lebanon. I think that's the next one to open up. I think we're going to see that pretty shortly. I think right now, Israel's trying to run out the clock, so to speak, because they hope to get a friendlier president, perhaps, on November. They also may need to take a break and steady themselves. But you have a large share of northern Israel that's been evacuated. And a lot of Israel says, we cannot tolerate this. We're getting all these incoming missiles every day. We need to defend ourselves. We're going to go in. Hezbollah has been spending years and years arming and preparing, and Iran may feel that their reputation's on the line. And just like we see tribalization at home, we see tribalization globally, right? We see increasingly an axis of countries all coming together, all assisting each other. There's the Western and there's the anti-Western axis. We didn't see this cooperation initially when Russia first invaded Ukraine. Yeah, we saw that pact of undying brotherhood between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. We didn't take it seriously now, but now China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran are increasingly interlocked in a common struggle. And a whole bunch of, large nations, probably topping the list was India, is just sort of playing, sitting on the fence, right? And the West is distracted. They're particularly distracted internally. Look at France lately, right? I mean, look at Europe. Look at Germany. As a matter of fact, look at most of the Western democracies. Their leaders are incredibly unpopular, with maybe the only exception, perhaps, of Giorgia Meloni of Italy. She's probably the most popular of any of them.
Yeah, it's fascinating just listening to you. Like I almost like don't want to ask the next question. I just want to like listen and absorb and take as many notes as I can. One of the things I wrote down, Neil, going back to just the election, November 5th, and the worry there, you said like that you think it will lead to a lot of risk taking. Could you just elaborate and help me understand what you mean by that?
So you have to understand that when you have this level of partisanship, where you have different groups which have irreconcilable worldviews and visions of the future, that they're not going to go along with a 51% majority against them, right? This is where democracy actually does break down. There's a great essay, by the way, in the book that I quote. It's from Carl Becker, who's a great intellectual historian. Is one of the people I read when I was in graduate school. He was an old man, I think you could say at the time. He wrote an essay in 1940 reflecting a kind of a dark meditation on democracy. Because during the 1930s, all these democracies are falling, right? I mean, in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, all these democracies would be taken over by dictators. Obviously, we know about Germany and Italy and in East Asia. And he started talking about democracy. He started talking about its weaknesses. And he said something really interesting and something that I've meditated on every day. He said, democracies only work well when there's nothing much to talk about. I mean, think about it. He said, democracies work well when the only thing you're talking about is the size of sidewalks and, the size of sewer pipes, just coordination problems. As soon as in a democracy, you start talking about fundamental questions of who we are and what our purpose is on this planet and why we are a country, the game is kind of gone, isn't it, Julia? I mean, you're not going to just say, oh, yeah, I guess I'm only part of the 49%. I guess I'll just change my mind. You see where I'm coming from, though, on this.
I see where you're coming from.
And I think that we recall earlier in the post-war era, certainly during the American High, what I would call the first turning, there was incredible homogeneity about it. People agreed on all the fundamentals. And in fact, the biggest complaint in the late 1950s, early 1960s, is that the two parties were pretty much the same. Tweedledum, Tweedledee. I mean, Kennedy and Nixon, how much did they differ when they ran against each other in 1960? Not much. They agreed what we should do in the USSR. They agreed mostly about the economy. They really didn't disagree on fundamentals. We started to have that disagreement in the 60s, although it was mainly youth movements outside the system. Where it began to enter the system was in the third turning. That was the unraveling. That was the culture wars. And it finally, this is an old pattern. But Julia, you've read the books. You know how this works again and again, right?
And for folks who are watching and listening, if they're not familiar, so in the first turning, that's the high. That is the springtime. The second turning would be the awakening. Yeah. And then the third turning is the unraveling. So that would have been like the 60s, like you pointed out.
No, the unraveling would have been the 80s and the 90s.
Well, wait, time out. Sorry. So the awakening was when the
awakening was the college protest.
Okay, that was the college protest. And I have it incorrect. Okay. So that was in the 60s, the unraveling, like you said, 80s into the 90s. So y'all wrote the book in 97. That was before the fourth turning started. So that was pretty rosy time.
Unraveling. And I would say the leitmotif of that decade in terms of a famous book was Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History.
Okay.
And it was a book about how individualism would triumph. That was the end of it. We weren't going to go anywhere after that. Individualism would overthrow all forms of authority. Governments would fade away, dictators, authoritarians. We'd all just be self-actualized individuals competing in the marketplace. And it's like all of us individuals would go into Starbucks every day, whip out our laptop, and then transact with other individuals all over the planet. Totally globalized, totally individuated, with no real government. I mean, if you think about that's kind of his version of Hegel. That's kind of where we end up at the end of history, right? And it's turned out to be totally wrong, of course. But it's interesting that was the vision, right? The Cold War was over. We had one superpower, the United States, and the United States favored a totally global world. We invited China into the WTO, right? I mean, everything was just going to be global. And we had a few little wrinkles to work out. You know, there was Rwanda, there was the Balkans, but we're going to get over all those things. And then suddenly, a new generation started coming of age. Millennials, Xers were by now really beginning to move into midlife. And so everyone's moving up a phase of life. And on schedule, community comes back. Authoritarianism comes back, and all the technology that back in the 1990s was supposed to promote individualism and the end of dictatorships, like the microchip and the internet, it was all going to undermine authority. Now the authoritarians love that stuff, right? They can monitor their populations. They can orchestrate hate mobs on social media. The very technology that Reagan and G.W. Bush and Clinton said was going to overthrow technology, overthrow authoritarians, is now the favorite tool of authoritarians, which shows you that technology doesn't do anything in itself. It's simply used by whatever the social mood wants. And today, the social mood wants community, they want order, and they will vote for these strong men, and we see it in so many places of the world. This is a new, if you want a decade that's similar to this, you really need to look at the 1930s.
Look at the 1930s. Yeah, I've heard that that a comparison made before. I think Ray Dalio made that comparison also on this show, which, yeah, we all know where that took us. Leading up to,
we know where that went.
Yeah, exactly. Question for you. So the fourth turning, which is the crisis period, would you say that's just to be clear, and I think I remember this in the book, that started around the great financial crisis. Was that the catalyst? Okay.
DFC was really the catalyst. You're
okay.
Absolutely.
So walk us through that, because I mean, it's interesting. I want to hear more on like the crisis period and what to expect, how to prepare, and maybe we can also bring in some of like we can bring in the economy as well, because folks are going to want to hear that as well, because a lot of people will come on the show. Well, I have a diversity of views. There are a lot of folks who come on the show are really worried about the economy and the direction we're headed. And then I have some folks who come on the show and say, it's a great economy.
Good, yeah.
Yeah. Might be great for some.
Look at the S&P, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty good right now.
But then I got to say, Neil, millennials, we're the ones who want to buy houses, and it's not really affordable.
Not looking good for them.
Yeah. So let's step back and hear more about the thesis of around the fourth turning, the crisis period, what to expect, how to navigate it. Again, take all the time you need.
Yeah, we go through. I mean, the catalyst was 2007, 2008. And by the way, the catalyst for a fourth turning often is accompanied, and increasingly, I think, is accompanied by a financial crisis. The last fourth turning was the catalyst was the crash of 29, which obviously started on Wall Street, but within a couple of weeks was actually in Austria, much of Europe. That just spread very quickly. Mm-hmm. And we've had similar, and I talk about that in the book. We've had similar downturns that accompanied fourth turnings historically. But I think increasingly that seems to be a feature of what shifts the mood toward the fourth turning. The thing that comes next, we also talk about precursors of fourth turning, which is really interesting, and that is what typically comes before a fourth turning, which is an event that occurs during the third turning, which actually points forward, which is very brief. It's part of the third turning, a time of individualism and celebrity circuses and all that, but it points toward the coming mood. Before 1929, it was really World War I, which did not directly hit America that hard, but it was this very brief period of, total mobilization for war, and then it was over. And immediately when it was over, we really hated it. We thought it was a terrible mistake. So briefly, we were very enthusiastic, and then when it was over, we hated it. The precursor for the Civil War was the Mexican-American War. The precursor for the American Revolution was the French-American War, which was a very large struggle, which actually resulted in the British finally taking Canada from the French. So it was actually very important. The precursor for the most recent fourth turning was the post 9/11 invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. And by the way, briefly, everyone was enthusiastic, and quickly we thought it was a horrible mistake. I think it was Robert Kagan who once said that it was exactly the way people felt about Wilson after World War I. Wilson lied and everybody died. Yeah. It's the same thing they're saying about G.W. Bush. So again, which actually ended up reinforcing the isolationism. If you want to know why America was so isolationist in the late 1920s and throughout most of the 30s, and why we resisted preparing for the global fascism that was beginning to expand, it was because we had learned our lesson from World War I, right? And the same thing, I think, has been true recently, right? Nation building, what a terrible mistake, going into Iraq and these kind of things, we could build nations. Terrible mistake, right? So this has been an isolationist period for us. It's already been to mobilize people on something like Ukraine or Taiwan, or maybe the Philippines is next. Who knows? You know what I mean? But it's difficult. So that's a precursor. It's very interesting too, because I talked to some people, precursors should remind us something, and that is trust in institutions can come back in a heartbeat when there's the right moment. I've had people tell me, Neil, you're crazy. This new community, the mobilization of America behind something. Are you kidding? That'll never happen again. And then I said, never happen again. I said, do you recall what GW's approval ratings were in the early months of 2002? February, March 2002? 94%, right? 94%. Why? Because America was scared. And he was the president. And this is something we forget, right? How quickly we come together when facing a common danger. And of course, that evaporated, obviously, in the time followed. Anyway, so you got the precursor, you got the catalyst. And then as you go through into the fourth turning, you get these waves that I call regeneracy, where community regenerates. And I think the first time you had that was 2016. And that was the Clinton-Trump campaign, which I think was the first regeneracy. I described that in the book, and I compare it to other fourth turnings. Why was it a regeneracy? Because it suddenly galvanized two very different partisan groups. We talked about it, red zone and blue zone. Mm-hmm. And that's when you had the first talk about the resistance, right, of the Democrats to Trump coming into Washington. And suddenly democracy was at stake. You know, all of this stuff is suddenly hyperbolic about, and this is the point I wanted to make about partisanship. This partisanship is not driven by hope. It's driven by fear. In other words, to most people who support Biden, I really don't think they care much what his state of mind is. I'll be honest with you. I think if he were known to be comatose, as was Woodrow Wilson, probably in, much the last year of his presidency, they would vote for him anyway, because anything is better than Trump. Do you understand what I mean by fear?
Yeah.
So I think that's where America is right now. Now, unfortunately for the Democrats, there are enough people sort of in the middle that probably won't work for them, right? I mean, not all of America is totally partisan. But I think that's where we are. And that's when I said people will take risks rather than lose. I think until recently, the Democrats thought they could get by with this. They may take risks. And I mean, your question is what Biden's going to do and whether he will step down. I don't know anything more than you do. You know what I mean? So I can't say the answer to that. But I will say one interesting thing about that election, 2016 and 2020, and I think it'll be reinforced again in 2024, and that is this will constitute the seventh great political realignment in American history. All political realignments in American history have always occurred either during an awakening or a crisis. We had give an example. We had the great realignment in the election of FDR in 1932 and 1936, where he fundamentally reconfigured the two parties. Suddenly, all the immigrants and working class in the cities voted for the Democrats, and you got some of them, Midwest farmers who voted for Republicans, but mainly it went hugely to the Democratic Party. It was a fundamental reconfiguring of the two parties. You had the next great political realignment. And by the way, this is just the nomenclature used by political scientists to talk about these big realignments. The next realignment occurred in the awakening. It really occurred in the late 60s, but really in the 1970s with the Southern strategy, all of the South turning from Democrat to Republican. And this is the next one. And what has happened to the parties? A fundamental reconfiguration of constituencies, which is always what defines a political realignment. The non-college working class has shifted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and the college-educated suburbanites have shifted from the Republican to the Democrat. And now to the top 1% and then top 10% of income and by income and wealth, households are voting Democrat for the Democrats, no longer for the Republicans. This is a fundamental realignment of the parties. I do think it was instigated by Trump, and it's accompanied a fundamental populist redefinition of what the Republican Party is. I think that was confirmed by the primary this year, right? And I think the Democrats are the inverse transformation. So we're reacting to that. And I've noticed now that political textbooks are beginning to talk about the last 8 years as being the seventh political realignment in America. So when I talk about regeneracy, this is the kind of stuff I mean. We may have another regeneracy. So it kind of comes and goes. We had more than one during the 1930s and World War II. But ultimately, Julia, toward the end of this fourth turning era, we will finally meet what I call a consolidation, which is we'll meet a crisis, which could be internal, could be external, where we will realize that the fate of our country is at stake. That happens every time during a fourth turning. And at that point, that leads to the climax, right? The climax is total mobilization for that cause, whatever cause that is. That may be one side or another of what it means to be an American nation, or it may mean America against external threats. And that climax then is followed by the resolution. The resolution is where all the agreements are made, all the post-war global institutions are created, all the treaties are signed, everyone goes home and starts their jobs again. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That is the end. The resolution is the end. We expect that to happen in the very early 2030s. That will be, around 2031, 2032, something like that.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm going here and I describe in the book, I just go by the periods, the numbers, the phase of life intervals that I see, and I kind of give a range of dates, but
yeah,
it's kind of where I am.
You mentioned just like another follow-on about being worried, and I suppose that could be the internal conflict that really worries you. Maybe it's like a personal question. Is that a reason? Is that a reason why you moved to West Virginia? Or I don't know if that's if that's relevant or anything.
No. I hasten to say it's not like that.
Okay, I didn't know if it was like to get away, like just be like, okay.
No, I'm not a prepper. No.
Okay, I didn't know if you were a prepper. No, because if you were, I definitely would want to know. I'm like, okay, what are you doing to prepare?
No, I moved out here basically because I get to have a huge amount of land at the top of a mountain. I get to see, 300 miles when I wake up in the morning. And what could be greater than that? What could be greater than that? And the people around here are wonderfully friendly. I will say I'm moving from the DC exurbs to West Virginia, where I live there. It was very blue zone, but it was very interesting because everyone had lots of money, but no one had any time, right? You come out here, no one has any money, but everyone has lots of time. Everyone will come out and help you if you have trouble. And there is more on the ground community here. There's no question about that. A very interesting study, actually, Julia, you'd be interested in this. Mm-hmm. There's a team of social scientists did this about 7 or 8 years ago. They looked at the probability that you know who your neighbor is, and they correlated that by the population density of wherever you lived, all across the United States. And they did that by census blocks. I don't know if you know what a census block is, but it's a very tiny group. I mean, it's smaller than a zip code. And guess what they found? It's a perfectly negative correlation. The more dense the population, the less likely you are to know your neighbor. So if you live in a New York high rise, you have no idea who's living around you, right?
Yeah.
But out here where I live, if your next door neighbor is a half mile down the road, you absolutely know who that person is.
So
right?
True. Well, I grew up in rural Virginia. And so, I know that, like knowing
your neighbors.
What
I'm talking about.
Exactly.
You absolutely know.
Like if something happened and there really was some sort of end of the world situation, you'd be okay. You're like, that person's raising cattle down the street. They have pigs. I have clean water. You'd be fine. But yeah.
Totally. Whereas when you live in a big urban environment, first of all, you're paying a lot of taxes. So you expect all the community amenities to be taken care of by somebody else. So you don't need to know your neighbors, right? Yeah. You got police, you got garbage people, you got this, you got that, right? There's someone else there's some anonymous person who's taking care of everything. Mm-hmm. It is interesting though, isn't it?
It is. It definitely is. Okay, so let's talk about let's turn and talk about the economy, and let's also throw in markets. I think you've been writing about markets lately as well, and I don't know if that's also tied to the
I did a big piece recently on passive investing.
Yeah, that's been a really interesting topic that's come up on this show. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm very fearful. I think this is going. I'm fearful this is going off a cliff because, everyone knew this was a problem. I mean, this goes back 20 years when at the very beginning, when people started moving toward, Vanguard, and Jack Bogle was the first, and then you had the rise of the ETFs and BlackRock and State Street. You know what I mean? I mean, just the whole thing, right? So earlier this year, we reached the point where all ETFs, all basically passive index funds, not just in equities, but in bond funds as well. We're more than half the funds. We're passively managed, and what worries me is that even the active managed funds aren't really active. They're what we might call closet indexed, because when you have the S&P doing so well, and particularly when you have the Magnificent Seven and the Magnificent Five or whatever doing so well, you can't afford to be beneath them for that long, right? And so you're going to always creep toward an index. Everyone's going to kind of become an index tracker. You know what I mean? Even if you claim to be contrarian. What bothers me and what worries me is how everyone is on the bandwagon. And I think that is aided and abetted. What started this was Harry Markowitz. And this was, 30, 40 years ago. And the idea that diversification is the only free lunch, right? So, indexing was great because then you get to automatically diversify. That started it. But I think a few other things are keeping it going. One is the fact that this passive indexing automatically benefits the biggest firms, because that's where all the indexes overlap with the biggest firms. So it naturally tends to channel money to the biggest firms. And of course, we live in an economy today with declining business dynamism in America, where the biggest firms enjoy pricing power, economies of scale, regulatory clout. I mean, all kinds of other things. That the biggest firms in banking and airlines, pharmaceuticals, I could go down the list, but they have market advantages. So they have advantages in the equity market, but the bigger they get, the more economic advantage they have. And then the more political advantage they have, because everyone will listen to them. And the final killer is the more downside advantage they have, because everyone knows that if Microsoft or Google or Apple fall by 50% in a day, Jerome Powell's going to be there with an emergency press conference and he's going to be doing something about it. But if it's something at the tail end of the Russell, I don't know, some little stock out there goes down 50%, they're not going to notice, are they? See my point?
Yeah.
So, and there's something else that I pointed out, and that's the psychology of the rising generation. I think that Xers as young adults were natural contrarians. They always figured most people my age, we're all going to lose. So I want to do some niche investment. You know what I mean? That's going to win. I'll be one of the winners and all my peers will be losers. I think the millennial mentality is very different. And the millennial mentality is, we're all going to be great because our parents always told us we're going to come out great. And I have the FOMO, right? It's the fear of missing out. So the last thing I want to do is not be wherever my friends are, because that's like the worst thing. And so their idea is, and not if you have lifeboats, you go in separate directions. You tie all your lifeboats together. So that's the perfect strategy, because either we all go up together. That's great. And then I don't have to envy my friend because he's going up just as much as I am. Or if it all goes down, you'll have to bail us all out, right? I mean, you can't let an entire generation go down. It's perfect, isn't it?
I'm like, yeah, we're kind of FOMO generation. Let me ask you though, with passive. Right. Okay.
Yeah, but that's the psychology of the passive. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Think of all those millennials that are investing in all those target date funds, which is what they do. And they're all just tied to the index. I mean, you know what I mean? It's all put in equities at their age.
How about like the 401k? Because, the 401ks is just kind of like automates. They're going into those target date funds. But what about the demographics when the boomers are retiring and they start to draw down? How do you think about how those dynamics might work?
Well, they will draw down. But again, if we don't get, additional investment from abroad, or we don't get additional, and, all these millennials are continuing to put all their, they have no, the default, right? So they're actually investing a lot more than boomers did at the same age, right? Because, as a millennial now, you have to opt out, whereas boomers, you have to opt in, right? So millennials have made that sort of the default choice. So millennials are actually saving at a pretty healthy rate at their age. They're certainly more serious about it. I talk to these people in their early 20s, are incredibly serious about saving. At that age, no boomer even gave that the slightest thought in their mind, right, about saving. So these millennials are very serious. But again, if it all goes down, they're all going to be bailed out. And by the way, that is something that actually matters to the fourth turning. Because when we mobilize the public for something really important, that's really important for this country, it's going to involve not just people, and that may be induction. That may be actually calling people out to do stuff. Maybe like Ukraine, you walk out your door, you're an entertainer, and someone puts a weapon in your hand. You know what I mean? It might be that kind of thing. But my point is that we'll mobilize people. We'll also mobilize wealth and income. And the way we typically do that in a crisis is we do that three ways. We issue a lot of debt. We may be constrained at this time in that, right? Just considering where our debt already is. We raise taxes and a lot of inflation. Inflation is a burden sharing mechanism, right? So I am absolutely convinced that as we move toward the crisis of a fourth turning, inflation is always a form of public burden sharing. It happens every time. And by the way, not just inflation, which immediately takes out, purchasing power away from those who are already investing in nominally denominated assets, like all those bonds out there, but financial repression, which means that you can't sell your bonds. Or if you're in a financial institution, you have to keep buying bonds at the rate that the government says. And by the way, we did that during World War II. And we did something very much like that during the Civil War when we created the greenback and we licensed U.S. banks and required them to buy U.S. debt. Remember, in a crisis, you do anything you have to do. And you distribute burdens into private players any way you can. Inflation is a beautiful way to do it. It's not a price, it's not a bug. It's the solution, to put it in the old, it actually is a way to solve the problem. And frankly, Julian, when I look at the CBO projections, which are already stupidly optimistic in terms of interest rates, in terms of their budget assumptions, when I look at those absolutely wacko deficits out there, this is before we have a crisis, right? What are we going to do? Well, a lot of benefits are going to be pared back. There are going to be a lot of taxes. There are going to be a lot of inflation. And all of this will be burden sharing. And by the way, it will create great opportunities for the younger generation because suddenly labor will be very well paid. That's the thing we'll need more than anything else. The
Even
same
in
thing
the age
happened.
of AI? So curious.
What?
Even in the age of AI.
To me, AI is just helpful to those people who happen to have those skills. And it complements rather than replaces high-end labor.
So inflation is going to be a huge factor during the crisis. Curious, Neil.
But I want to say every fourth turning has had inflation during its climax, and so this is not like sort of a possibility. I'm just saying it is the logical way to go. Now, for instance, during the Civil War, we had inflation on both sides. The South couldn't really float much debt, and it didn't want to raise much taxes. So in the South, it was almost all inflation. Now, in the American Revolution, the expression ain't worth a continental. We know how much inflation there was then. Alexander Hamilton had various ways of sort of solving that and getting back the credit of the United States after the Constitution was created. But my point is that the inflation is always a part of this process. It almost has to be. It's the only, in a sense, neutral way you can rework the rules and defund the people who currently have the most assets. Remember, when you're in a crisis, you need to get resources in any way you can. It's a question of survival. So no one's going to really care too much about how you do it.
Yeah. How are you preparing for that scenario? Do you own gold? Do you do things like that? Thinking about like how to.
I think, I think gold is good. I'll tell you, the first thing in looking at a fourth turning to me is actually not financial. Knowing who your friends are, because that's always very important in a crisis, and also finding out a way. And for a lot of people, this takes a lot of patching up, but finding out a way to be close to your family. Families become very close in a crisis. Just look at the stories of anyone who went through the very end of the Great Depression and World War II. Look at the Civil War. Look at any of these periods of crisis. Family becomes really important. And in the end, for those of us who are growing older, there is no adequate long-term care insurance you can buy. It's your family. You know what I mean? I mean, in the end, you can forget it. You need to have your family around. And I will say, one sign that we're in this sort of fourth turning era is the enormous renaissance of extended family living in America. Everywhere I go, I'm surprised to see this. How many, the share of 20-somethings, even people in early 30s living with their parents, is higher than any earlier time, except when was the last time it was high as today? The late 1930s. In fact, the census measured it in 1940. It was at the very end of the Great Depression, and that's the last time it was as high as today. So again, this is another constant. And you remember those old grainy black and white Frank Capra movies with Jimmy Stewart, as a young man, like Mr. Smith goes to Washington, or You Can't Take It With You, and it always shows that the peers of Jimmy Stewart living in some big Victorian rambler with his parents, right? Families were close.
Yeah. I think that is such a great place to wrap this conversation. Know who your friends are, and your family is so important. Before I let you go, Neil, let folks know where they can find more of your work. Obviously, everyone go pick up the book if they haven't. But I know you have an amazing Substack as well, which I think you also publish a podcast on there.
Yes.
Where they can follow you on social. If you want to add any other parting thoughts, anything that they should
No,
think
that's
about.
the main thing. The Substack is called Demography Unplugged. And a lot of what we do is we follow demographic trends. We haven't talked too much about demography per se, but, it's always interesting. A lot going on, fertility, mortality, migration. I also talk about, politics, the globe, a little bit about fourth turning, so everything is there. And you're right. We also have a podcast on that. Usually once a week we do.
Well, Neil Howe, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, all of your knowledge, your wisdom. I absolutely just love having you on the show. I love listening to you, learning from you. I know the audience does as well. And I hope that maybe we could do this every year, if you wouldn't mind, just to come on and give us an update on where we are. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much, Neil.
Thank you so much, Julie.